March 1, 1943. Blackett Strait, Solomon Islands. The darkness came first, absolute and impenetrable, the kind that swallows sound before it can travel 10 feet across open water. It was 0200 hours, and the narrow channel between Kolombangara and Arundel Islands lay wrapped in a tropical night so thick that even the phosphorescence in the wake of ships seemed muted, ghostly. The air hung at 84 degrees, saturated with moisture that made cotton uniforms cling like second skin and turned every breath into something you could almost taste: salt, diesel fuel, decaying vegetation from the jungle shores less than 1,000 yards away on either side. 4 Japanese destroyers moved through this blackness in column formation, their bows cutting the glassy surface of Blackett Strait with the confidence of vessels that had owned these waters since the dark months of early 1942. Aboard the lead ship, Destroyer Division 11's commander stood on the bridge wing, his binoculars scanning a horizon he could not see, listening to the steady thrum of turbines that had carried the Imperial Japanese Navy across half the Pacific. The war was 20 months old, and in that time these waters had become a highway for Tokyo Express runs, the fast destroyer convoys that brought supplies and reinforcements to garrisons clinging to jungle outposts throughout the Solomons. The Americans called it the Rat Run. The Japanese called it survival. Neither side called it what it truly was: a grinding war of attrition fought in darkness by men who had long ago stopped believing in quick victories. The war had come to these islands not with grand declarations, but with the slow, methodical logic of strategic necessity. After Midway had broken the myth of Japanese naval invincibility in June 1942, and after Guadalcanal had become a festering wound that consumed men and ships throughout the autumn and winter, the entire character of the Pacific War had shifted from lightning conquest to desperate defense. The Japanese Army and Navy found themselves defending a perimeter that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, island chains whose names had meant nothing to Tokyo planners 2 years earlier, now consuming resources at a rate that military logistics could barely sustain. Colombar, Vella La Vella, New Georgia, these jungled rocks in the central Solomons had become vital nodes in a supply network that was already fraying at the edges. Every night, fast destroyer forces raced down the slot, that narrow channel between the island chains, carrying drums of supplies, reinforcements packed into every available space, sometimes troops clinging to the deck itself because there was no room below. They came at night because daylight belonged to American aircraft, to the Wildcats and Dauntless dive bombers that prowled from Henderson Field and the expanding network of airstrips the Americans were carving from coral and mud across the southern Solomons. The Tokyo Express had become a race against dawn, a calculated gamble that speed and darkness could substitute for the air superiority Japan no longer possessed. But on this moonless night in early March, something had changed in the equation, though the men aboard those 4 destroyers did not yet know it. The Americans had introduced a new variable into the nocturnal calculus of the slot: small, fast, expendable boats crewed by young officers barely out of training, vessels built of plywood and powered by engines designed for luxury yachts, armed with torpedoes that had been failures in submarine warfare, but might, someone in the Navy Department had theorized, prove devastating when launched from close range in darkness. The PT boat, Patrol Torpedo Boat, had arrived in the Solomons in October 1942, and in the month since, these 80-foot craft had been learning the brutal lessons of close-quarters naval combat. Most patrols ended with nothing more than engine trouble and near misses. The Japanese destroyers were faster, better armed, and crewed by men who had been fighting at sea since the invasion of China. The PT boats were plywood coffins that could be shredded by a single shell, crewed by reserve officers who had been selling insurance or studying literature 18 months earlier. The tactical manual for PT boat operations against destroyers did not exist because no one had seriously believed such engagements would occur. Yet here they were, night after night, small American boats playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek with vessels that outweighed them by 2,000 tons. Lieutenant Robert Searles had been in command of PT-109 for 3 weeks when he received orders on the afternoon of March 1st to take up station in Blackett Strait and intercept any Japanese vessels attempting the passage south toward Vila. He was 24 years old, a 1941 graduate of Northwestern University who had joined the Naval Reserve because it seemed like the responsible thing to do when the draft was calling up everyone he knew. His crew consisted of 10 men, the oldest barely 30, most of them younger than their commander. They had trained together in Rhode Island on boats that actually worked, then been shipped to Tulagi, where they learned that nothing about PT boat warfare resembled the training scenarios they had practiced in Narragansett Bay. The engines overheated in tropical waters. The torpedoes often failed to fire. The radios worked when they felt like it. The plywood hulls, advertised as lightweight and fast, absorbed moisture from the constant humidity until the boats wallowed through the water like barges. But the crews adapted because adaptation was the only alternative to dying, and by March 1943, the PT squadrons in the Solomons had developed their own doctrine born from survival rather than strategy. Searles brought PT-109 into Blackett Strait at 2100 hours, running on muffled engines, the big Packard V-12s throttled back to minimize wake and noise. The boat carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, though everyone aboard knew the weapons had reliability issues that engineering officers in Pearl Harbor were still trying to solve. The torpedoes ran too deep, or their magnetic exploders failed to detonate, or the contact pistols proved too delicate for the shock of impact. But at close range, very close range, the kind of range where you could see the faces of enemy sailors in the light of their own fires, even faulty torpedoes sometimes worked. The tactic was simple to describe and terrifying to execute. Idle in the darkness, engines barely turning over, wait for the Japanese destroyers to pass close enough that you could not miss, then fire all 4 torpedoes in a spread, slam the throttles forward, and pray you could accelerate to 40 knots before the destroyer's deck guns found your range. It was not naval tactics, it was ambush, the kind of warfare that submarines practiced, but with none of the armor or stealth a submarine possessed. PT boats were visible, fragile, and utterly dependent on darkness and surprise. The Japanese destroyer crews, for their part, had learned to regard PT boats with a mixture of contempt and wariness. The boats had sunk nothing of consequence in the previous 5 months. They were nuisances, mosquitoes that occasionally drew blood but posed no strategic threat. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized speed and firepower. Get in, unload supplies, get out before dawn brought American aircraft. PT boats were obstacles to be brushed aside with deck guns, targets for the 5-inch main batteries if they presented themselves stupidly in open water. But they were not, in the estimation of most destroyer captains, genuine threats to a properly handled warship. This assessment was based on experience. PT boats had attacked dozens of Tokyo Express runs and achieved little beyond wasting torpedoes and occasionally forcing a destroyer to take evasive action. The young American officers commanding those plywood boats were brave to the point of recklessness, but bravery without skill was just another form of suicide. Or so the logic went aboard the destroyers of Destroyer Division 11 as they entered Blackett Strait at 28 knots, confident that speed and established patrol routes would see them through another night. Searles heard them before he saw them, the distinctive turbine whine of Japanese destroyers running at high speed, a sound that carried across flat water even through the ambient noise of jungle insects and distant thunder. He ordered engines cut to idle, and PT-109 settled into the water, rocking gently in its own rocker. Wake. The crew took positions without being told. The torpedo man crouched at the tubes, ready to pull the firing lanyard. The gunners on the twin 50 caliber mounts swung their weapons toward the sound. Though everyone knew the machine guns were useful only for making the crew feel better, you could not hurt a destroyer with 50 caliber fire unless you were suicidally close. Searles stood beside the helm, one hand on the throttles, eyes straining into darkness that revealed nothing. The sound grew louder, resolved into multiple sources, not one destroyer but several, moving in column. Standard Tokyo Express formation. They would pass within 500 yards if they held course. close enough that even the unreliable Mark 8 torpedoes might strike their targets before diving too deep or failing to arm. What the Japanese lookouts could not see, what their radar, still primitive compared to American systems, could not clearly distinguish from the island shorelines on either side, was that PT-109 had drifted into a perfect ambush position. Searles had idled his boat in a natural choke point where the strait narrowed to less than 2,000 yards, and the Japanese destroyers, running fast to make their schedule, were committed to the channel. To turn away now would risk grounding on the reefs that fringed both islands. To slow down would mean missing the tide window at Vila and facing daylight attack from American aircraft. So they came on, 4 destroyers in line. The lead ship less than 600 yards from PT-109's bow when Searles finally caught the faint silhouette against the marginally lighter sky to the west. He waited 3 more seconds, letting his eyes confirm what his ears had reported. 4 ships, not 3, not 2, then gave the order to fire all torpedoes. The Mark 8 torpedoes left their tubes with compressed air hisses that sounded enormous in the silence Searles had carefully maintained. 4 white wakes traced lines across the black water, phosphorescence marking their passage like tracer rounds. The lead destroyer's lookout spotted the wakes instantly. Torpedo. Tracks were impossible to miss even in darkness, and shouted the alarm. The destroyer captain ordered hard rudder, and 1,800 tons of warship began a turn that would have been impressive had there been time to complete it. There was not. The first torpedo struck the destroyer amidships at 0207 hours, and the sound of the explosion rolled across Blackett Strait like the crack of a breaking planet. A column of water and debris erupted upward, illuminated from below by the orange flash of the warhead detonation, and for 3 seconds the entire scene was visible in terrible clarity. The destroyer heeling over from the impact, the 3 following ships scrambling to evade, PT-109 suddenly exposed in the light of the explosion like an actor caught in a spotlight. Searles had the throttles full forward before the sound of the explosion reached his boat. The 3 Packard engines screamed to full power, and PT-109 leaped forward, bow rising as the hull came up on plane. Behind them, the second torpedo struck the lead destroyer near the stern, and this explosion was deeper, more muffled, a magazine or fuel tank detonating below the waterline. The destroyer began to list heavily to port, and men were already abandoning ship, jumping into water that was on fire from spilled fuel oil. The second destroyer in column, confronting with the wreckage of the lead ship directly ahead, attempted to swerve around the crippled vessel, and in doing so presented its full beam to the last 2 torpedoes. One missed, running true, but passing ahead of the bow by 30 feet. The other struck below the bridge with a crack that could be heard 15 miles away at the American Coast Watcher station on Kolom Bangara's northern tip. The Japanese could not believe what had happened. In 20 months of war, PT boats had been an annoyance, not a threat. They had absorbed hundreds of shells, wasted countless hours of destroyer time in evasion, forced Tokyo Express runs to take longer routes. But they had not in any engagement, anyone aboard. These destroyers could recall, inflicted mortal damage on a major warship. Yet in the span of 40 seconds, 2 destroyers were sinking in Blackett Strait, and a third was firing wildly into darkness at a target it could no longer see. The PT boat had vanished back into the blackness from which it had emerged, engines howling as it raced for the cover of the Arundel Island shoreline. The 4th destroyer, the last in column, opened fire with every weapon that could bear. 5-inch main guns and 25mm anti-aircraft batteries sending tracers and high-explosive shells arcing toward where PT-109 had been. Most of the shells struck water. A few hit the jungle behind the fleeing boat, setting trees ablaze and revealing in their light how close to shore Searles had taken his vessel. He was running through water less than 3 fathoms deep, scraping bottom occasionally, threading between coral heads that would have gutted his plywood hull if he had struck them squarely. The engagement lasted 40 minutes, from first torpedo launch to the moment the surviving Japanese destroyers withdrew north. And in that time, the arithmetic of naval warfare in the Solomons underwent a fundamental revision. 2 destroyers, the Minigumo and the Murasame, went to the bottom of Blackett Strait in less than 20 minutes each, taking with them 374 officers and men and the supplies they had been carrying to the garrison on Kolombangara. A third destroyer, the Shikinami, suffered damage that would require 2 months of repair at Rabaul, effectively removing it from the order of battle during the critical spring campaigns. Only the 4th destroyer escaped undamaged, and it carried back to Rabaul a report that stunned the staff of the 8th Fleet. A single American PT boat had executed a perfect ambush against a superior force and won decisively. The implications cascaded through Japanese naval planning like a fault line opening. If PT boats could sink destroyers, then the Tokyo Express was no longer a viable resupply method. If the waters of the slot were no longer safe for fast destroyer runs, then the garrisons throughout the Central Solomons could not be sustained. And if those garrisons could not be sustained, then the entire defensive perimeter in the South Pacific was compromised. But the shock ran deeper than strategic calculation. The Japanese Navy had built its doctrine on the superiority of the warrior spirit, the belief that discipline and courage could overcome material disadvantage. Every man in the fleet had been taught that Japanese destroyers were the finest in the world, that their crews were better trained, their ships better designed, their tactics proven in combat from Pearl Harbor to the Java Sea. The Americans, in this calculus, were rich but soft, technologically advanced but lacking the martial spirit necessary for close combat. Yet here was evidence that contradicted the doctrine at its core. A PT boat, a vessel constructed of wood, crewed by reservists, armed with faulty torpedoes, had sunk 2 fleet destroyers in 40 minutes. Not through superior spirit or better training, but through tactical innovation, perfect positioning, and the willingness to accept risk that bordered on suicide. The Americans had learned to fight in darkness without seeing their enemy, to turn weakness into strength by refusing to fight the way doctrine said they should fight. They had learned, in short, to win by ignoring the rules that should have guaranteed their defeat. Aboard PT-109, racing south through the darkness toward Tulagi, Searles and his crew experienced their victory as a kind of stunned disbelief mixed with terror that they might still be caught and killed before reaching safety. The torpedoes had worked. The ambush had succeeded. 2 destroyers were sinking, confirmed by the sound of secondary explosions echoing across the water as magazines detonated. But they had also been seen, identified, and fired upon. And somewhere behind them, Japanese destroyers might be pursuing, might be closing the range even now. Searles kept the throttles full forward until the engines began to overheat, then throttled back just enough to keep the temperature gauges out of the red. The crew said nothing, each man alone with the knowledge that they had done something extraordinary and might yet die for it. The symbolism of the moment would not become clear until later, until after-action reports were written and analyzed, until the staff officers at COMSOPAC headquarters in Noumea could place this single engagement within the larger pattern of the campaign. But in that moment, racing through darkness with Japanese shells still falling in the water behind them, the crew of PT-109 understood one truth absolutely. They had fought a battle that should have killed them, and they had won. The victory at Blackett Strait became a template that other PT boat crews studied and attempted to replicate in the months that followed. The tactics SEALs had employed, idling with engines barely turning over, waiting for visual confirmation before firing, launching all torpedoes in a single spread to maximize the chance of hits, then immediately running for shallow water where destroyers could not follow. These became standard procedure for PT squadrons throughout the Solomons. But the engagement also revealed something about American naval warfare in the Pacific that would define the entire campaign from 1943 forward. The willingness to adapt, to discard doctrine that did not work, to empower junior officers to develop their own solutions to tactical problems. Searles had not followed any manual when he positioned PT-109 in Blackett Strait. He had improvised based on experience, on watching other PT boats fail in their attacks, on understanding that the only advantage his vessel possessed was surprise, and that surprise required patience, stillness, and perfect timing. The Japanese Navy, for all its skill and courage, remained bound by doctrine, by the belief that proper procedure and warrior spirit could overcome tactical disadvantage. The Americans, less burdened by tradition, proved more willing to experiment with failure as the price of eventual success. The symbolic element that emerged from this engagement, the detail that appeared in every after-action report, and eventually in the popular imagination, was the sound of the Packard engines. The PT boats were powered by 3 Packard V12 marine engines, each producing 1,500 horsepower. Engines that had been designed for luxury yachts and racing boats before the war repurposed them for military service. These engines represented American industrial abundance in its purest form, overpowered, wasteful of fuel, requiring constant maintenance, but capable of extraordinary performance when pushed to their limits. Japanese destroyers were powered by turbines that were efficient, reliable, carefully designed to balance speed with range. The Packard engines burned fuel at a rate that would have horrified Japanese naval engineers, consumed oil, threw parts, and required rebuilding after relatively few hours of operation. But they could accelerate an 80-foot plywood boat to 45 knots in flat water, and they made a sound, a deep, thunderous roar when running at full throttle, that became the auditory signature of American naval power in the Solomons. Japanese sailors learned to recognize that sound, learned that it meant PT boats were close, learned that the roar of pack of engines in darkness meant torpedoes were already in the water. The sound became a kind of psychological weapon, a symbol of American industrial capacity that could afford to put 4,500 horsepower into a boat that cost less than a single destroyer gun turret. It represented a philosophy of warfare fundamentally different from Japanese practice. Where Japan carefully husbanded its resources, maintained its equipment to extract maximum service life, designed weapon systems for efficiency and reliability, America built with abundance, replaced rather than repaired, accepted waste as the inevitable byproduct of overwhelming production. The Packard engines epitomized this approach. They were not the best possible engines for PT boats. They were simply the engines America had available in quantity, engines that could be produced by the thousands, shipped across the Pacific, installed by crews with minimal training, and run until they failed, at which point they were discarded and replaced. This was not elegant warfare. It was not the martial philosophy celebrated in Japanese doctrine. But it was effective, brutally effective, in a way that rendered elegant doctrine irrelevant. In the weeks following the Blackett Strait engagement, Japanese destroyer captains began to alter their Tokyo express runs, adding time to the routes, running farther from shore, posting extra lookouts, training searchlight crews to sweep the water ahead of the formation. But these measures cost speed, and speed was the only advantage the destroyers possessed against American air power. Runs that had taken 4 hours now took 6. The margin of safety before dawn shrank from comfortable to non-existent. By April 1943, the Tokyo Express had become unsustainable, not because American forces had interdicted it completely, but because the risk-to-reward calculation had shifted. One PT boat engagement, lasting 40 minutes, had initiated a cascading series of consequences that forced the Japanese Navy to reconsider its entire supply strategy in the Solomons. The garrisons on Kolombangara, Vella Lavella, and New Georgia began to starve, not dramatically but steadily, as supplies became irregular and reinforcement schedules stretched from weekly to monthly. The slow strangulation of Japanese positions throughout the Central Solomons began with many factors, but the engagement at Blackett Strait represented a turning point, the moment when small unit tactics demonstrated they could achieve strategic effects. The men who fought these actions rarely understood the strategic implications of what they were doing. Searles, interviewed years after the war, described the Blackett Strait engagement as lucky and terrifying in equal measure. He had not believed the torpedoes would work. He had not expected to survive the return fire.
The success of the ambush felt less like skilled execution than like temporary suspension of the laws of probability. This humility was characteristic of many American combat veterans from the Pacific War, a recognition that survival often depended as much on chance as on skill. But the humility masked a deeper truth about how the war was fought and won. American forces learned to create conditions where luck could matter, where individual initiative could influence outcomes, where junior officers were encouraged to take risks that military doctrines said were unacceptable. The Japanese Navy, brilliant in the execution of pre-planned operations, proved less adaptable when confronted with situations that had no precedent in doctrine. They could not learn as quickly because learning
required admitting that doctrine might be wrong, and such admission struck at the foundation of the warrior ideology that sustained the entire military system. The transformation in Japanese naval thinking after Blackett Strait was subtle but profound. Prior to March 1943, PT boats had been regarded as a nuisance, requiring tactical response but not strategic consideration. After Blackett Strait, they became a primary threat that shaped operational planning. Destroyer runs began to include dedicated escorts tasked specifically with PT boat suppression. Air reconnaissance devoted resources to locating PT boat bases. Intelligence officers analyzed captured documents for information about American torpedo technology and tactics. But all these responses shared a common limitation. They assumed that superior force and better information could negate the PT boat threat. They did not address the fundamental advantage American forces possessed: the industrial capacity to lose boats, lose men, lose battles, and return the next night with replacements drawn from a reservoir of material and human resources that Japan could not match. PT-109 could be sunk, and PT-110 would take its place. Searles could be killed, and another lieutenant, fresh from training, would assume command. The individual boat, the individual crew, was expendable in a way that Japanese destroyers and their veteran crews were not. This expendability, paradoxically, became a form of strength. Because PT boat crews knew they were replaceable, they took risks that would have been unthinkable in a military culture that emphasized preservation of veteran forces. Because the boats themselves were cheap, $300,000 for a vessel compared to $8 million for a destroyer, American commanders could accept loss rates that would have been catastrophic for more expensive weapon systems. The result was a kind of warfare that privileged aggression over caution, tactical experimentation over doctrinal purity, individual initiative over centralized control. Japanese forces, fighting from a position of diminishing resources, could not afford similar losses. Every destroyer sunk was irreplaceable. Every veteran crew killed represented knowledge that could not be recreated through training. So the Japanese Navy became progressively more conservative in its operations, more focused on preservation than on aggressive action, while American forces learned to spend material and lives with an abandon that seemed almost careless but was actually calculated investment in tactical learning. The epilogue to the Blackett Strait engagement unfolded over many months, as the tactical lessons spread through the PT boat squadrons and as Japanese forces adapted to the new threat environment. PT-109 itself continued operations until August 1943, when it was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer in Blackett Strait, the same waters where it had achieved its greatest success. Searles survived, as did most of his crew, and he returned to command another PT boat within 3 weeks. The cycle of loss and replacement continued throughout the Salomons campaign, through New Georgia and Bougainville, as PT boats evolved from experimental weapons into established elements of American naval power in restricted waters. The destroyers Minagumo and Murasame remained at the bottom of Blackett Strait, their wrecks eventually becoming diving sites in the decades after the war, physical evidence of the night when plywood and Packard engines proved sufficient to sink steel and steam turbines. But the deeper legacy of that March night transcended the specific ships and men involved. The engagement represented a collision between two philosophies of warfare, two approaches to the problem of how nations organize violence in pursuit of policy.
The Japanese Navy had built its doctrine on excellence: superior ships, superior training, superior spirit. The American Navy, less confident in its own excellence, built its doctrine on abundance: more ships, more men, more willingness to accept failure as the cost of learning. In the waters of the Solomons, abundance proved decisive not because it could overwhelm excellence through sheer numbers, but because it could afford to experiment, to fail, to adapt, and to return night after night until the experiment succeeded. The PT boat program embodied this philosophy. Most patrols achieved nothing. Most attacks missed. Most boats were lost to accidents, mechanical failure, or enemy action without inflicting significant damage. But the few successes, like Blackett Strait, justified the entire program because they achieved effects disproportionate
to the resources invested. The sound of those Packard engines roaring through tropical darkness became, in the memory of men who served in the Solomons, the sound of American power in its most elemental form: wasteful, overwhelming, indifferent to cost, relentless in its application. It was not a beautiful sound. It did not carry the aesthetic elegance of doctrine properly executed or tactics perfectly planned. It was the sound of industrial civilization brought to bear against an enemy that had underestimated not American courage or skill, but American capacity to endure loss and continue fighting. The Japanese had believed that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that the warrior ethos could defeat democratic softness. What they learned in places like Blackett Strait was that democracy, when fully mobilized, possessed its own form of strength. Not the strength of individual excellence, but the strength of collective abundance, the capacity to accept casualties and continue operations, to lose battles and win campaigns, to spend blood and treasure with a profligacy that seemed almost criminal until the final accounting showed that such spending had purchased victory. On that moonless night in March 1943, when PT-109 emerged from darkness to sink 2 destroyers and vanish back into darkness, the engagement lasted only 40 minutes, but the reverberations continued for the remainder of the war. It was not the largest naval battle in the Solomons. It was not the most decisive action, but it crystallized a truth about the Pacific War that would define every campaign from Guadalcanal to Okinawa: that American forces would win not through superior skill or better doctrine, but through the willingness to learn from failure and the capacity to sustain losses that would have broken a less wealthy nation. The plywood boat and its 10-man crew represented the future of American naval power more authentically than the battleships and carriers that dominated strategic planning. Small units, aggressively deployed, empowered to take initiative, supported by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. This was democracy at war, not as ideology, but as practice. Industrial fact. And the sound of those Packard engines roaring through darkness was its signature, its promise, and its threat to any force that believed courage alone could substitute for the capacity to endure.